Longyear Museum's collection includes 8 houses made historic by the fact that they were homes lived in by Mary Baker Eddy. Each house represents a stage in Mrs. Eddy's pathway forward as her life's mission advanced. Generous gifts, grants, and donations are enabling Longyear to restore and preserve these landmarks for the future. For years to come, the restored houses will help visitors learn more about the discoverer, founder, and leader of Christian Science as they retrace her footsteps.
Visiting these historic houses brings their stories to life, reminding us of the spiritual import of what occurred here. As we cross each threshold, we are retracing the footsteps of the discoverer of Christian Science.
Here in North Groton, New Hampshire, we are in the cottage where, widowed and recently married to Daniel Patterson, Mary Baker Patterson came with the hope of making a home for her son. It was not to be. In the next 5 years, her son was taken from her, and her health declined until she was an often bedridden semi-invalid, making for a house of gloom and loss. Yet these same walls witnessed some intuition stirring in her thought. Here, experimenting with homeopathy, and as always immersed in her Bible, she made a vow that if God restored her to health, she would devote her remaining years to helping sick and suffering humanity. After 5 years, her husband's livelihood failed. The home was foreclosed. Most of what they owned was lost to creditors. Yet the spark remained.
In this house in Rumney, Mary Patterson's search for health continued. From this place, she set out for Dr. Vail's Hydropathic Institute, and thence for Portland, Maine, and the magnetic healer Phineas Quimby. Both made much of mental influences in their treatments. Both theories ultimately proved to be disappointments, but she still looked to trace all physical effects to a mental cause, in accord with the Scriptures.
In Swampscott, Massachusetts, after a succession of moves, the Pattersons rented an apartment on the 2nd floor of this house on Paradise Road. Here, the crucial events of February 1866 unfolded. It was here that Mrs. Patterson was brought after falling on an icy sidewalk in Lynn and spending a dreadful night in a home near where she fell, in critical condition. She was carried gingerly up the stairs to the 2nd floor kitchen. In this kitchen, near the heat of the stove, she was placed on a cot, barely able to move, let alone walk. In this parlor, worried friends waited, fearing for her life, while 2 rooms away, on the cot in the kitchen, she prayed and sought help, as always, from her Bible. Here, Mrs. Patterson, against all the doctor's prognoses, but inspired by an account of Jesus healing the sick, announced she would walk.
To use Mrs. Patterson's own words, she said, "I am going to walk." Those present thought her mind wandering. She immediately pushed herself unaided to the side of the bed, placed her feet on the floor, and walked to the side of the room and sat in a chair. Then she says, "This is all through prayer." George Newhall.
That healing here marked a turning point in her thought. What she needed now was peace and quiet to ponder what her healing might mean. But a few months later, this house was sold. The Pattersons moved to temporary quarters in Lynn. There, her husband of 13 years deserted her. Left on her own, she moved from place to place in and around Lynn, eventually resuming the name of her first husband, Glover. Eventually, the Pattersons divorced. Through all this, she was seeking to understand the healing she had experienced and apply what she understood to healing others. Wherever she went, Mrs. Glover treated patients through prayer.
The healings and her explanations of them began to attract attention. In one boarding house, a fellow lodger, a young shoemaker named Hiram Crafts, asked her to teach him her healing art. Moving in with Crafts and his wife south of Boston, Mrs. Glover began her teaching, with Hiram as the one lone student, her first. When Hiram abandoned his healing practice under family pressure, his teacher had to move once again. Here, in Amesbury, Massachusetts, we're standing in a room that represents a long succession of rented rooms during a 9-year period when Mrs. Glover had to move repeatedly, all the while exploring her discovery and looking for ways to share it with others. Finding a refuge here in Sarah Bagley's home in June 1868, Mrs. Glover taught her second and third students, Miss Bagley and Richard Kennedy.
Her stay here in Stoughton was a 1.5 year respite from all the packing and unpacking. Sally Wentworth invited her to live here in exchange for teaching her the healing art. In this room, where young Lucy Wentworth came for heart-to-heart chats and her brother and his friends played boisterously, Mrs. Glover wrote what would be her first copyrighted work, The Science of Man. She returned in 1870 to the Bagley House in Amesbury, before moving on to Lynn, where she has said that city resounded with my cures, and where she taught a small but growing band of students.
Her stay here marked the start of a remarkable decade of healing, teaching, preaching, and publishing. In 1872, she laid her other activities aside to take up her pen. There was a great work to be produced.
Years later, Mrs. Eddy recalled, "Such a flood tide of truth was lifted upon me. At times it was overwhelming, and I have drawn quick breath as my pen flew on, feeling as it were submerged in the transfiguration of spiritual ideas."
One of her students from those days described her single-minded perseverance in the face of virtually living out of a trunk.
Settled at last, here in her own home in Lynn, working in her little study under the eaves, she wrote the final pages of Science and Health, and in 1875 published its first edition. Here she wrote and published its second and third editions. In this parlor on the first floor, she taught students, established the Christian Scientists Association, and chartered her church and the Massachusetts Metaphysical College. And here, in January 1877, with her marriage to Asa Gilbert Eddy, she became Mary Baker Eddy. From here, in 1882, she moved to Boston. There, her Massachusetts Metaphysical College grew rapidly.
From her first class with one lone student, now there were hundreds clamoring for instruction and joining in the beginnings of a worldwide church.
Toward the end of a hard-fought decade, Mrs. Eddy left Massachusetts, moving eventually here to Concord, New Hampshire. This rented house at 62 North State Street offered a peaceful retreat away from the hectic demands of Boston. Here she could find some leisure moments to entertain a 9-year-old neighbor from across the street, Helen Dadman. She could occasionally enjoy ordinary pleasures, like giving her new young friend a wooden Noah's Ark toy to play with and learn from. She could even spare a carefree hour on the balcony overlooking the street, with Helen beside her, cheering a passing circus parade.
Despite such moments of ease, her remove to Concord was not to be a retreat from her cause. This house stands as a reminder of the work the now 70-year-old leader of Christian Science faced over the next 2 decades, assisted by a growing staff of secretaries and household helpers.
From here, she rallied her students meeting in Boston, writing, "My beloved students, I am still with you on the field of battle, taking forward marches, broader and higher views, and with the hope that you will follow."
Here she took the dramatic first steps toward restructuring the church in Boston, dissolved the Christian Scientists Association of the Massachusetts Metaphysical College, and closed the college.
She announced to her students, "I close my college in order to work in other directions where I now seem to be most needed, and where none other can do the work."
Throughout the first year in this house, she revised her book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, line by painstaking line, until the landmark 50th edition was ready for publication. And as all this went on here, Mrs. Eddy summed up the substance of her life and work in her book, Retrospection and Introspection.
In 1892, Mrs. Eddy moved once more. But perhaps this move felt different. On the outskirts of Concord on Pleasant Street, she settled into a house from which she could see the hills of her childhood home. She named it Pleasant View. The setting of Pleasant View, with its fountain, pond, and garden paths, was idyllic. But within, the work went on. In the arduous years ahead, she would reorganize the church in Boston as the Mother Church, build its edifice in Boston, ordain the Bible and Science and Health as its pastor, establish its educational system, write its manual of bylaws to govern it, handle attacks against herself and Christian Science. In 1908, her forward steps led Mrs. Eddy to return to Boston, to a home overlooking the hills and housetops of Chestnut Hill. Here she launched the Christian Science Monitor and continued her leadership of the Christian Science movement.
All this and more is brought to mind by the historical collections and by the carefully preserved historic places where Mrs. Eddy lived during the advancing steps of her life work. To remember those particular days of old is not just to reminisce, but to understand, and to appreciate anew what was required of Mary Baker Eddy to bring Christian Science to humanity. As Mary Longyear said,
"We must know her, her motives and her simple natural life, know her struggles and her overcoming of them. We must learn to endure and love as she did."